Hello, thank you so much for joining us for the APIs 101 webinar. I'm going to do a tiny bit of housekeeping before we start. I am not going to be looking at the chat or the Q&A during the session, but my lovely colleagues are online and they can get a hold of me on Slack. If you do want to ask some questions, if you make sure that you pop those in the Q&A, that's the little Q&A button, rather than the chat, and that way we'll try and make sure we get you an answer. Hopefully we'll have some time for questions at the end too. And any questions that we don't cover, we'll try and cover those on the website. After the session, we're going to send you out a link to the video and also a page with some of the answered Q&A questions. And if you still have a question that hasn't been covered, jump onto the community forum. That's community.postman.com and someone will help you out. So this webinar is really designed to give you an introduction to APIs in general. You don't need to know anything about APIs or Postman. Hopefully you'll be able to follow along and we'll learn the basics in making API requests. My name is Sue. I'm developer educator here at Postman. I'm part of the developer relations team. So I work on a variety of education programs, including documentation and content like this webinar. And you can get hold of me on Twitter if you want to. So what are we doing? We're going to start by looking at a few key concepts in APIs, but we're going to spend most of the session in Postman. So if you have Postman installed and you want to follow along, you can definitely do that. I'm going to try and go at a nice pace so that people can follow along. If you don't have Postman installed, you still have plenty of time to do that because I'm going to show you a few slides first. So jump onto postman.com/downloads and get it installed if you want to follow along. You can also follow along from the video afterwards. We'll send that out to you. And we're going to use a template in the session today, and you can actually use that to follow the same steps that we do today independently if you prefer. So we're going to have a look at some key concepts. We're going to jump into Postman. We're going to get hands-on with some API requests and send a few, get some errors probably, figure out how to fix them. And then we're going to look at some follow-up learning topics and resources. And I'm going to see if there are any nice questions for me to answer at the end. So what are we talking about? Helpfully, in tech, we use the term API to refer to loads of different things, which is not great when you're trying to learn. But what we're talking about today is the type of API that provides you with access to data. So typically, you're going to see the phrase client-server quite often in relation to APIs. So your data is typically on a server, and then you make requests to carry out operations on that data from a client, and that's typically a website or a mobile app. And the API is what manages that process. It's what manages the communication between the client and the server. So normally your client is going to be a software application, but one of the core features of Postman is that it is an HTTP client. So we can use it to make requests. And historically, Postman has been used a lot for testing and developing. You can actually do all sorts of other things around APIs in it, including learning. It's actually a very low barrier place to learn about APIs because you don't have to write code to use Postman. You can if you like, but you can do all sorts of API operations just within the user interface and without having to worry too much about technical stuff if you don't have that background. So you can make requests to APIs that you're building yourself or that someone on your team has built. You can also make API requests to what we call third-party APIs. So say if you wanted to make requests to the Twitter API, for example, you can do that inside Postman too. Today, we are going to use a demo API. Now, It's not a production API, but it is a real API that is built on Glitch. And it's going to model customer records. And it's quite a simplistic API. It doesn't really look like an actual production one, but it's going to help us get acquainted with the basics of retrieving data, adding it, updating it, deleting it, and we're going to do all that inside Postman. So we're going to be using a template, and I'll show you how to install that, how to import that into Postman during the session, but you can also use it on your own afterwards. And you can also remix the API that we're going to use, and I'm going to show you how to do that at the end too. So first of all, let's just run through some of the core concepts in APIs, and these are going to get reinforced when we actually get inside Postman. We're going to see all of these in action. So your API request is going to have a few core components. It's going to have a method, and we use the method to determine the type of operation that we're going to perform. So we're going to do some GET requests, and GET requests we typically use to fetch data, just to retrieve it. We're going to have a POST request, and we use that to add new data. We're also going to have a PUT and a DELETE, and those are for updating and deleting data, as you can guess. Each request is going to have an address. Now, this is exactly the same as when you open up your web browser and you pop an address into the address bar. It's exactly the same process as when you make an API request. And your API request address is going to have, usually it will have a base part of the URL, and then it will have a path. And there will be different paths for carrying out different operations, for interacting with different data and services. And we're going to see all of these inside Postman. So typically, you're going to want to specify different levels of detail in your APIs, and the configurations are going to depend on how the API has been set up. So if you're building your own API, of course, you have complete control over what details each request requires. If you're working with a third-party API, that is all going to be determined by the API provider. So typically, you're going to want to look at their documentation to see what is required to make a successful request. If we want to make a request for more specific detail or data, we're probably going to be using parameters. So today, we're going to have one request that's a kind of generic request, and it just asks for all of the customers in the database. But then we're going to have a second request that's asking for a specific customer. So we're going to use a parameter to specify that customer using they're going to have a unique ID or some sort of identifying data property that we can use. We are going to try out query parameters and path parameters today. And your requests and responses when you work with APIs, they have headers and they have a body. So you can think of the body as being the core data and the headers as information about that data. So say, for example, we're sending a request to add a new customer to the database. So we're going to have the customer details in the body. In our case, we're going to use JSON format for that, but you can use different formats. And in the header, we might have a header to indicate that it's in JSON so that the server knows how to process that when it receives it. So the headers help the applications at either end to interpret and process the body data. Hopefully, when we send a request, we're going to get a response. We might get an error response, but hopefully we're going to get some sort of response. One of the core pieces of data that you're going to get back in your response is the status code. And that is going to indicate the success or failure of the request. There's a lot of different detail that you can get in there. We're going to see some error codes today. And that is very intentional because when you work with APIs, you're going to get error responses. So there's absolutely no need to be demoralized by that. It's completely normal. If the API has been well designed, you're going to get some useful information in the error response, That unfortunately doesn't always happen, but what we're going to use the error response to do is figure out next steps. So it's very normal to be getting error responses. So if you start after this session to play around with APIs and you're getting all these errors, that's just part and parcel of working with APIs. Again, we're going to have headers and body in the response, and inside Postman we can do various different things to view and process the body data. The other thing to mention about the errors is that this is one of the main reasons that Postman came to exist in the first place, is that working with APIs is very unpredictable. And sometimes you need tools to help you figure out what is actually going on, what is going wrong with your requests, why are they not working the way you expect them to? And that's somewhere Postman can actually be really helpful. And finally, we're going to look at some common types of configuration that you're going to need. If you're working with a real-world API, particularly a third-party API, or any API where you're actually updating data, you're going to have to deal with authorization. And it's sometimes quite a big barrier to people when they're learning about APIs, because there are so many different types of authorization set up. They all work slightly differently. Some of them are really complicated. This is another place Postman's quite handy, because you can pop in your authorization details and Postman will figure out how to attach them to the request. So there's a level of automation there that is quite helpful. But again, once you start working with APIs, you have to fully expect that you're going to have some challenges around authorization. So again, that's just normal. So without further ado, let's jump into Postman. Hopefully you can see it. I've got it mega zoomed in, so it looks huge to me, but hopefully it's rendering okay for all you. So if you're in Postman, hopefully you're going to see something similar to what I'm seeing. If you're already a Postman user, you might have a slightly different layout, but when you first open the app, it should look something like this. Make sure you have the build mode selected down at the bottom right. It's going to look quite different if you don't, and we have the build mode when we're actually creating requests and sending them, so that's where we want to be. Now, I'm not going to go into a lot of detail on the Postman UI, because this session is really not about Postman, it's about APIs. So I'm going to touch on the key places in Postman that you're going to need to know about if you want to use it to learn about APIs. I'm not going to dwell too much on the different features in Postman. This area in the centre though, this is where we're going to be building our requests. And we're also going to be using this collections section on the left. So first of all, we're going to import a collection. And that is going to help us work through the API request basics. So you want to go up to the top left and hit the orange new button. And that's going to pop up a modal. And mine looks a bit squashed because I've got it so zoomed in. Yours might look a wee bit different. Now you want to select the templates tab. And this is a place that I would strongly encourage you to explore if you want to continue learning about APIs, because in here, these are actually community contributed templates. So most of them are not official Postman resources. They've been contributed by community members. And there's some interesting fun stuff in there, that there's a lot that's really helpful for learning. You can basically import these into your Postman app and just start playing around with requests. So it's a great learning resource to have. So we want to pop into the search and search for API 101. And hopefully you're going to see one that comes up that has the little featured tag on it. And once that pops up, I want to click that. And if you see my wee face on there, you know you've got the right one. Give everyone a wee minute just to do that. And we're going to use the Run in Postman button. Now you might see this Run in Postman button elsewhere. You'll see it published around the web, because you can actually create your own templates and share them with anyone to import. So some organizations will use a Run in Postman button in their API documentation, for example, and you just hit that orange Run in Postman button and it's going to open the collection in your Postman app. So once you've got that ready, hit the button. Now, if quite a lot of us are doing it at the one time. It might take a minute for a few of you to get that imported, but hopefully not too long. And once it's imported, you are going to see it on the left in collections. Make sure you've got collections selected there. So the collection is just a group of requests. You click the collection, it's going to open them all up, and you're going to see that we have 5. We're going to work through all of these during the session. So I mentioned when we were in the slides that we use different methods. So the get, post, put, and delete here, these are the methods. And you can see from the request names that these all correspond to the different types of operation that we're going to perform. So go ahead and click the very first one, get all customers, and hopefully that will open. And you'll see it with all of its configuration detail in the center. We're not going to go into too much detail on configuration because this is quite a simple request that we don't need to do anything to. You'll see the get method on the left. We could change that if we wanted. You can see that there are tons of different methods, but we don't want to. We want the get method selected, so we just leave it. And we have the base URL for the API. So this is an API that was built on Glitch, and that's why it has that in the address. And the path that we're using is /customers. So you can go ahead and hit send, and this is where I cross everything and hope that it works. It worked for me, I hope it works for everybody else. It tends to be quite reliable, so hopefully it has. So to begin with, we had all of our request configuration up in the top here. In the lower part, we have the response. Now, again, if your Postman is set up slightly differently, you might have a different layout. We have a lot of configuration options over that. But in the bottom, we've got the response that come back from the Glitch API. And it's presented in the body section here. Something to look at, 200 OK. So this is the status code. And 200 OK is what you're going to get typically when you've made a successful request to retrieve data. That means everything's all right and you've got the data back that you asked for. And when you hover over, as you can see, Postman gives you a little bit of context because there are actually a lot of different status codes. It's quite hard to remember what all of them mean, so that can be quite handy. Another thing to mention about status codes though, although we have typical uses of status codes, there really is quite a lack of standardization in the API world. So you're not going to find the same codes used 100% consistently across APIs. So you might find that you get one code for a particular type of operation with one API and a different one when you use a different API. So just be prepared for that not to be quite the same in every API that you use. So what else have we got in the response? We've got cookies, headers, test results. We're not that bothered about that. We're really just bothered about this section. You can drag that to get a better view. So the API sent us back JSON data. And typically when you're using an API, you're going to be dealing with raw data like this. But we have a sneaky little trick that we can use to make this a little bit more readable. We want to hit the visualize button. And that's going to present it in a slightly more readable view. And this is just a little quirk of Postman that we're able to do this. So if you're working with APIs in another tool, you're not going to have this option. You're going to be working with the JSON. But we're going to look at the JSON too. So we sent a successful request. And our request was to retrieve all of the customers in the database. So it sent us back this JSON. Now, don't worry if you don't know JSON. You don't need to follow this. I'll explain a little bit, but again, I'm not going to go into a huge amount of detail on the data itself. This little square bracket, that means that it's an array that we've got back. And that's because there are several customers in the database. And each one is represented as a JSON object. And that's what these curly braces indicate. Each customer has a few properties. They've got an ID, a name, and a type. And as I mentioned before, this is obviously quite a simplistic API, but it'll be enough for us to learn some API basics. All right, so we got all the customers, great. What if we want one in particular? Open up the get one customer request next. Now, straight away, you're going to notice a slight difference here, and that is that the API URL is using a variable. This is another Postman tool. Don't worry too much about it. We included a variable with the template so that we don't have to type in the same URL over and over again. So you can imagine that can be quite handy if you have a ton of different requests that are using the same URL. And you can also use it for things like if you have a production version of your API, you've got a development version, and they've got a different URL, you can use variables to just toggle between them. So the address is pretty similar here. It's a get method again. It's /customer this time, singular, because we only want one customer. So go ahead and click send. Let's see what happens. So we've got an error response. And I do this intentionally because quite often an error with APIs is not something to avoid. It's something that's going to give you more information about how to complete your request. So sometimes I'll be setting up a request and I'm like, I know this is not right. I know I don't have the information I need in here, but I'm going to hit send anyway and see what happens, because that's going to help me figure out what's missing, what I've still to do, what I've set up wrong. So we get a 404 this time, which means that what we asked for was not found by the API. So let's hit visualize again so that we get a slightly more readable view here. So we asked for one customer, but we didn't specify which customer we wanted. And this is where we're going to need a parameter. So back up in your request configuration, you're going to want to select params, and we're going to add a query parameter. So click into the key field and stick ID in there. And then you can just stick one. You can actually put in any number that was in that list that you saw come back in the previous request. I'm just going to stick one in because I'm lazy. So you'll see that this has actually been added to the address. This is the query string, the bit of the address that comes after the question mark. And you can have multiple parameters here. And when you do have that, they'll be chained together with the and character, the ampersand character. And again, you'll probably recognize that from browsing the web. It's exactly the same. If you're browsing like Amazon or somewhere, you're going to see these really long URLs that have all these query string parameters on the end of them. It's exactly the same. So we have got our ID in place. This means that we're asking for the customer with the ID value of 1. Go ahead and hit send. And hopefully you're going to get a customer back. If you used an ID that was not present in the database, you're going to get an error response, but that's hopefully going to help you figure out what you've done wrong. So this time we got back a single JSON object rather than the list that we had in the previous one, because we only want one customer this time. And again, the customer has the same properties, ID, name, and type. So that's all very well, but what if we want to add a new customer? Maybe we have a set of customers and we're out on the road and we're trying to add new customers as we come across them, and we're doing it from a mobile app or something. Open up the post request. That's post add new customer. So you'll notice that the address is very similar. It's exactly the same actually as the last one, but with a post method. And what happens when you do this is that the API knows which endpoint, we call these endpoints in the API, it knows which one you want. Sometimes we call them routes, and don't get people started on the difference between them because it's no fun. So the API is going to be able to distinguish between these in spite of the fact that they both have the same address, because they have different methods. It's going to know which one we're after. So again, I can't be bothered setting anything up. I'm just going to hit send and see what happens. And pop into the visualize view again. And this time we'll get a 401. And this is a status code that you're going to encounter a lot when you work with APIs. Because we are trying to add data, we need to authorize. We can't just be letting anybody add to the data. We need some sort of way of securing the data. And you might also hear people talking about authentication versus authorization. Authentication is where you're identifying the client application that is making the request, and authorization is where the API is establishing whether you have permission to carry out the operation that you're trying to carry out. So someone might have permission to view data but not to update it, that type of thing. And if you're working with a third-party API, you're going to want to refer to their documentation on what their authorization requirements are. And again, they do vary a lot, but typically your official documentation is going to explain how to authorize. Sometimes you'll have to sign up to a program and get credentials. Maybe you get an API key or something, and then you're going to include that in your request. So let's have a look. And sure enough, this one, it wants an API key from us. So we're going to go into authorization up here in the request builder. And you'll see from the type drop-down list, there are tons of different types of authorization. And popping your details into these little helpers in Postman is a lot easier than figuring out how to attach them all to the different bits of the request. So what we're wanting is API key. I'm going to shove that down a wee bit. So API key is basically, it's a key value pair. It's a key that's a text string and then a value that's also going to be a text string. And you can add them to either the header or the query parameters. And helpfully, this error message told us exactly what to put in here. So you can go ahead and type that in. It's auth_key. Oops, try and type it right, unlike me. And then for the value, because this is not a real production API, you can pretty much put any text you want in there and hopefully it will work. So pop your key and your value in there and make sure you have header selected, because that is where the API is going to look for that information. Got our authorization in place, let's hit send. And we get another error, but it's a different error. So that's progress. That means that we fixed one problem and now we can move on to the next one. So this time it was a bad request. So why was it a bad request? Let's see. So we're supposed to be adding a new customer here, but we didn't actually specify the customer data. So we're going to need to provide the API with the information for the customer that we want to add. And we're going to do that in the request body. So select the body. I'm going to shove this down a wee bit. Now you can include lots of different types of body data. We're going to use raw data. So just select the raw radio button. And then from the drop-down list where it initially says text, we're going to want to select JSON because we're going to use JSON data. And then we're going to pop the customer JSON data straight in here. And helpfully, it's sitting here in the response from the previous request. So if you're as lazy as me, you're just going to copy and paste it. And that way, you know, you're going to know that the syntax is right. So we're providing a name and a type for the new customer. We're popping that into the body. And now we're going to try again and see what happens this time. So we're going to hit send. And it worked. Hopefully it worked for you too. If not, we'll help you out later, I promise. You can get us on the forum. This time we get the 201, which is quite common when you're creating new data. It's a successful response. It begins with a 2. Normally, if you're getting a status code that begins with a 2, that means it was successful. Begins with a 4, probably not successful. If it begins with a 5, something's gone badly wrong on the server usually. So we managed to add a new customer. And to verify that, we can go back into that first request that we sent. That's the get all customers one. Let's send it again. And hopefully we're going to see our new customer in here. There, it's there. And I can see from that number that a lot of you are actually following along, which is nice to see. So thanks for that. Hopefully you're seeing something similar. You're going to see a different ID because the way that we've set this API up is that you're only, hopefully, if everything goes according to plan, you're only going to see the data that you add, and you're only going to be able to update and delete the data that you add. You're not going to see anyone else's data. So yours will have a different ID, but if you copied and pasted like me, you're going to have the same name and type. Now let's pop back in. What are we doing next? Now we're going to update the same customer. So open up the put request. You might see patch used for updating. These were historically used in very specific ways. Typically in the past, you would use put if you're replacing an entire record, and you would use patch if you were just updating some fields within the record. These are, I find, not particularly consistently used anymore. You're most commonly, I think, going to see put rather than patch, but either one of those is for updating existing data. Now you can see that we've got a slightly more complex address here. We've got the base part as usual, and then we've got the path, and then we have this funny looking bit of the path. This is a path variable. So sometimes you're going to use APIs that actually require dynamic data as part of the URL. It's similar to when we added to the query string, but it's just part of the actual path. So we can include data variables in the path, and you'll see that it's in the params section here, and it has a key and value, just like the query parameter did. So again, let's just go for it and hit send and see what happens. And we get a 401 unauthorized, but hopefully now you know the drill. So you know what we need to do. We need to go into authorization. We need to select API key, and hopefully Postman's been kind and just put that in for you and you don't have to type it again. So we're having auth underscore key and a text string as value. We're adding to the header. This is exactly the same as the previous one. So once you get that set up, just hit send again. And again, this is deja vu. We're getting used to these errors. The request is incomplete because we're trying to update a customer, but we haven't specified which customer we want to update. And that is what the path parameter is for. So you're going to pop into params, and you can see there's a placeholder value. You're going to want to replace that with the ID that you saw in that list when you had added the new customer. So I'm going to pop back in and just check it. This is mine, yours is going to be different. So you're going to want to copy the value from the customer that you had added from that first GET request. And you're going to pop that in as the value here for the customer ID path variable. And when the request is sent, Postman's going to swap that path variable in for the value that you've provided. And note that this is only going to work when you include the correct ID for one that you added. You're not going to be able to update other people's. So make sure you've got the ID from the one that you had added. And let's see what happens when we hit send. We're still not there, but we're getting closer. So it's still a bad request because we specified the customer we want to update, but we haven't said what details we want to update yet. And we're going to do that similarly to what we did when we ran the post request to add the new customer. We're going to go back into the body, and we're going to select raw again, and we're going to select JSON again, and we're going to copy, unless you're really enthusiastic and want to type all that out. But I'm not. I'm just going to paste it in. And again, the structure of the data is just the same as when we were adding a new customer. We've got a name and a type. So once you've got that in your body, you're going to hit send again. Hopefully you're going to get a 201 because we've managed to update the data successfully. And like before, we can just double check that by going back into the get all customers request, hit send, and let's see, this is what it was before. Let's see what it is now. Oh, something's gone wrong. Oh dear. bear with me. I am gonna have to do something a bit sneaky here to fix this. I might have hit a limit with the glitch API. Bear with me one moment. Sorry about this. Why has that happened, I wonder? I could try and fix this, but I'm wondering if instead I should pop into an alternative API. We have a mock API that I had ready as a backup. I'm getting a note here saying that someone might have deleted the users. Let's see, do you know what I'm going to try? That's interesting because what we're doing here is using this variable. This is the little glimpse into how the back end works. What happens when you send that first request? We're going completely off at a tangent here, but it might be interesting to some of you. What is happening when you send the first request is that we're setting a unique ID. And then when you send to the API, that's how it's tying what it sends back to you. So I'm going to try sending this first one again. Nah, we're having no luck at all. And am I getting this correct, that this is actually working for some of you? Is it just not me that it's working for? Bear with me one moment, my colleagues are just telling me here. Oh, it is working for other people. All right then. Something's gone weird in mine. Okay. I'll need to figure out what that was afterwards. Okay, so with any luck then, I'll just carry on and hope that you're getting the desired results. Hopefully what you should be getting here is that updated customer. But something has gone on wrong on the back end, so I apologise for that. This is the first time we've actually used this API. But if that worked, great. Hopefully you've managed to update your customer, and I will have a look and see if I can fix that after this session. I don't want to waste everyone's time by having you watch me sit and try and fix an API during the session, but I'll do that afterwards so that if you're using this in future, hopefully it will be more reliable. The next step is probably going to have a similar issue for me, but maybe it will work for some of you. This one is where we're going to remove a customer, and it's very, very similar to the previous one. I'm going to hit send. I don't know if I'm going to get a good result here. That's what I was expecting to happen. So it's unauthorized again. And by this time, hopefully you know the drill. You can pop in, put your API key in. You've got the key and the value, and it's added to the header. Let's see if we get it authenticated. And again, we don't have the information completed. We need to indicate which customer we want to remove. And this is theoretically supposed to work the way that the previous one did, and that you're going to go into params and you're going to put your ID in here. I have a sneaking suspicion it's not going to work for me since it didn't work last time. Maybe it'll work for some of you, who knows? But you're going to want to pop in the ID of the customer that you had added and that you had updated, because that's the one that you're theoretically going to have permission to edit, and hit send. And mine is coming back invalid because that ID is not recognised, which is not a huge surprise since it didn't come back when I sent the GET request. But if your ID was valid, hopefully you've got a confirmation there that it was deleted. And if it was, you can run that first GET request again and hopefully see your customer deleted. So apologies for that last couple, didn't go entirely to plan, but I suppose it's just a demonstration of all of the things that can go wrong with APIs, and some of the places that Postman can be quite handy. So before we jump back out of Postman, I just want to show you another collection that's in the templates. So you want to hit that orange new button again. And this time we're going to search for API Learner. And this is a similar API. Once you see that, it'll be featured again. Once you see that pop up, just open it up. So this is also an API that we built on Glitch, but it includes instructions on actually remixing the API. So if you're interested in learning how to build APIs, you're going to pretty much need to pick a technology. Node.js and Express are very popular. So if you Google how to build a REST API with Node.js and Express, you're going to get tons of really good tutorials coming up. But for me, I prefer, rather than starting from scratch, I like to start from an example project. And so on Glitch, there are tons of starter projects that you can remix and tweak. We use it quite a lot. I use it a lot for demos at Postman if I need to throw an API together quickly. And if you use this template, you can actually jump onto the project on Glitch and remix your own copy of it. And it's going to explain to you how to make connections to your copy inside Postman. So you can be in Glitch making changes to your API, you can be adding endpoints, you can be changing the behavior of endpoints, and you can be jumping back and forth between Glitch and Postman to track your progress. So you've got Glitch providing your server-side stuff, and then Postman providing the client, and they play quite nicely together. So it's a nice place to be learning. And before I jump back out of the templates, I want to just highlight a couple. So when you come in here at first, you're going to see the most popular ones, like this one, for example. This is one from our senior developer advocate, Joyce, and Joyce has a ton of templates in here for learning. So you definitely want to check those out. Another thing that's worth checking out is, I think I'm searching the right thing. I'm cool. If you search for public REST APIs, you're going to find a collection from our evangelist Kin, and this has requests in it for loads of APIs that don't require authentication. So you can just start hitting them straight away. You don't need to bother going and getting set up as an API key and worrying about how to provide the authorization information. You can just start hitting them straight away. So those are really handy if you just want to get to know APIs and get a little bit more comfortable with them. So on that note, I'm going to jump back into the slides. So to build on what I've learned is to make sure you've tested the API you're going to use in a webinar properly, which clearly I have not done, although it may just have been the volume of people, because a ton of us were hitting it at the same time. I'll blame that and say that it wasn't my fault. So of course we used a collection. That template section that I showed you in Postman, they're just collections. It's just collections that you import into your Postman app. You can import the one that we used from the URL there that I've got on the slide anytime you like, and hopefully it should guide you through the process. And you're also going to find in the same section of Postman the API network, and that's where companies actually post their official Postman collections. And so if you want to connect to a service that provides a public API, in their Postman collection, they're going to provide you with a load of sample requests and also usually instructions on how to authenticate if you need to do that. So that's a good place to start if you're trying to connect to a service. And you can create your own collections. Collections are actually the gateway to a lot of the more advanced features in Postman, like collaboration. So those are quite handy to know about. Variables, so we saw one variable in the collection that we had there for the URL. You can reuse values using variables, and they're quite commonly used for authentication, where you might want to be careful about exposing API keys and credentials and that sort of thing. So variables are quite handy for that. If you want to just mess about with API requests, but you don't have an actual API, you can use mock data in Postman. You can create a mock server, and just give it example data to return when you make a request. And that's quite handy when you're maybe a bit concerned about interacting with a real data source and you just want to be messing about with requests and learning, and you know that it's not real data, so you don't need to worry about messing anything up. And finally, just to hammer the point home again, troubleshooting requests. You're going to have to do that when you're working with APIs. It becomes normal and it stops being frustrating, in all honesty, because it is so normal. And this is one of the main reasons that Postman became popular, because it provides tools for troubleshooting. And the Postman console being the main one, you're going to find that in the bottom left. You hit that when you need some extra visibility into what happened with a request, what went wrong, you know, what the configuration was. So before we jump into the Q&A, I'll just point at some resources for further learning. The Learning Centre is where all of our documentation lives. You're going to find resources on Postman in there. The API network, which I showed you in that the orange new button up at the top left, you can view that on the web as well, explore.postman.com. And the community forum, community.postman.com. On there, you're not just going to get access to the Postman team, you get access to the wealth of knowledge that is in the Postman community, which is massive. If you're having a problem, someone on there has probably already had that problem and is going to be able to help you. So I thoroughly recommend jumping on there too. And finally, if you could take a minute for us to fill in the survey, get the survey link here. It really only takes a minute or two, and we do feed the input there into future sessions, so we really do want your feedback. We take it really seriously. Obviously, it would be ideal if the API we were using worked, but I think that's probably a given. But any other feedback, much appreciated. So I think we've got about 10 minutes left, so I'm going to have a look and see if we have any questions. All right. Can Postman be used to create our own customized APIs using a server endpoint, or can it only be used to test the API requests for various operations? Okay, so you're not actually going to be building the API endpoints inside Postman. However, we do hope to build out the ability to do that in future. Something that you can do in Postman right now is you can generate client code. So if you're building a front end for an API and you're testing it in Postman, you can use the request configurations that you've set up to actually generate client code to make requests to the API. And we're hoping to build out the ability to do that on the server side as well. Something that you might want to look into if you're working on a comprehensive API, if you're using something like what you might call an API first strategy, the API builder in Postman is where you can develop specifications for APIs, and you would typically then use those as the starting point for building your API. I think that answers the question. May I know how to create variables at the collection level? I actually showed you that, but I'll jump back in. So when I was trying to figure out why that wasn't working, I went into the collection edit menu here and I popped over into variables. So these are your collection variables. So you can see the URL that we were using. So there's the address. And if you look at the variable name there, and look back again, this is how we refer to the collection variables. You use the double curly braces around them in variable name. Hopefully that answers the question. Can you update database tables with APIs? Yes. This would traditionally be the main usage of an API. You'll have some sort of data source, maybe a database, and maybe some sort of other data source. But your API is managing the operations on that data, and that's going to include updating the tables. Do all software run on APIs? If not, what is an example of something that doesn't? That's a hard question, but what I will say is that one of the reasons Postman's become really popular in recent years is that APIs are really central to software development now and increasingly becoming a core component of almost all software. That's something that we've seen really increase exponentially in the last few years. But that doesn't mean that absolutely all software uses APIs, because that's not quite the case. How long will this API be up for us to test? I'm going to leave that API up. Hopefully, maybe tomorrow I'm going to fix it so that it actually works when you try and use it. Maybe it's still working for you, but yeah, I'm going to leave that API up indefinitely, and I'm going to leave the template up. And also, what I would recommend if you're interested in using it is signing up for Glitch and remixing it, and then you can do your own version of it because it's completely open. So yes, it will stay up. Is it possible in Postman to see the raw request which is being sent to the URL? I'm going to just show you the console. Right, this is the console down at the bottom. And it's going to have an entry for every request. There's the last one that we sent. So you just click to open them. And you can see the raw log if you want that. But you can drill down into all the request details, network information, headers, body. You can see absolutely everything in here. So this is why this is quite a handy place for troubleshooting, because you might realize that you were missing some part of your configuration. Okay. Where did I configure the API URL? I think I've covered that one. Can we create customized authorization? I'm not 100% sure what you're after there, but I'll talk a little bit more about what is in here. What we've tried to do is provide common configurations for authorization, just to really ease that barrier, because it is such a huge barrier, as you'll find when you start getting into APIs. So these are the most common ones that people have asked for, and we're always trying to add to these. And if you have a configuration that isn't supported, please tell us in the Postman app support repo. That's on GitHub. This is not every type of authorization. These are the most common ones, but you don't have to use the authorization helpers. You can configure your request in any way you like. So if you have an authorization scheme that requires you to add something to the header, you can do that. The authorization helpers in the list are just there for that level of automation where you don't want to configure all the details. But if you want to configure all the details, you can do. Okay. Get some questions I'm not entirely sure about. I think we will probably try and answer those on the site. One I can answer, is there a template for using APIs for testing? Yes, I'm going to show you that. So the very first template that pops up when you go into that new button, or you go into explore.postman.com and select templates, the very first one that comes up is one from our lead developer advocate, as I mentioned, Joyce. And this has tons of requests in it. I'm actually just going to import it so you can see it. It's got 24 requests in it. It's got all sorts of stuff. And this also is worth mentioning. This uses the Postman Echo API. It's postman-echo.com. You can use that API anytime you like. It's freely available. We use it in loads of templates. You basically send it, whatever you want to send it, and it just echoes back what you sent it. So there it's shown as the parameters that we had up in the query string there. If you've got body data, it's going to echo all that back to you. So that's really handy, and the test collection is really handy. You're probably going to find more like that in the templates. That is where I would start for getting some example test setups. You can see how to actually add tests to your API. You can also, I'm slightly wary of going into this in case people are from less technical backgrounds. You don't have to deal with any of this if you don't want to. But the tests tab there, that is where you're going to add your test code, and you're going to write it in JavaScript. We've got some snippets here on the right that can save you a little bit of hassle. You can click to add those and tweak them if you don't want to write it from scratch. But this collection gives you a load of example test assertions. And when you run the request, you're going to get the test results down here in the response. Hopefully that answers that question. Can you explain about the test tab? I've slightly touched on it there. On the Learning Centre, we have tons of examples as well of the JavaScript. I would say if you're trying out test code and you're getting stuck, that's where the community forum's great, because there are loads of people on there who do all sorts of complex tests and have been using Postman for years, and they're going to be able to help you set up your tests. If more than one API URL are created, will all show up in the dropdown. I'm assuming that this is a question about the API URL variable. I think that this is the answer that you're looking for. Because this is a variable, we have a few different types of variable in Postman. So you might have more than one variable with the same name. And this is where scope comes into play. If you go onto the Postman Learning Centre and search for variables, you're going to find the information about how Postman knows which scope, which version of the variable to select. So you can have more than one with the same name. Hoping that answers the question. How do we know what path to use? That's a good one to finish on. So in this, we had, for the first one, we had /customers. Second one, we had /customer. This short answer is that is going to be determined by the API. So if you're building your own API, that's up to you. You decide what the paths are. But if you are using a third-party API that someone else built, you're going to want to go onto their documentation, or if they've got a developer portal, or if they've got a Postman collection. The Postman collection is going to give you example requests. Like, I pop back in here for a second, go into the API network, you're going to see that there are a load of companies here that have got Postman collections. So when you import those into Postman, they're going to have example requests, and that's going to help you to know which paths you want, rather than you having to figure it out by yourself. And oh no, I've got one last question. This is a good question. Can you tell us about creating an API? Now, as I mentioned, you can Google tutorials, you can follow tutorials, but I would thoroughly recommend a platform like Glitch. When you go on to Glitch, there's an app on it called Hello Express, and it's a sample REST API. And you can use that as the basis for your own and connect it inside Postman or anywhere else. You don't have to use Postman. Just any kind of client that you want to test it out. That is what I would recommend for creating an API. It depends on your background. If you're comfortable learning a framework from scratch and starting an application from scratch, go ahead and go through those tutorials. You're going to want to know what technology you want to use. As I said, Node.js and Express are probably the REST API technologies that you're going to find the most learning resources on, but there are tons of other technologies you can use. But if you're at the less technical end of the scale, if you've got less coding experience to date, I would recommend a platform like Glitch, because you're going to get some starter applications that you can just tweak instead of having to write everything yourself. I think that answers the question, and I think we're just at time. So thanks again so much for joining us, and I'm going to go and get that fixed, that API fixed, if you want to use that later. Hopefully it will actually work. And thank you again. Hope to see you at some future webinars. Cheers.